Have you ever loved someone who disappeared while standing right in front of you? Someone whose body came home but whose soul stayed somewhere you could never reach? I have. And the person who vanished wasn't a stranger. It was my husband. He came back from the war in the summer of 1945, and I spent the next 40 years living with a ghost. It was a Saturday afternoon in June 1953. We were at a neighborhood barbecue in our backyard in Cleveland, Ohio. The smell of charcoal and cut grass filled the air, and children were running through sprinklers, their laughter cutting through the warm afternoon. I was wearing my yellow sundress, the one James used to say made me look like sunshine. Our neighbors, the Hendersons and the Richardsons, were there with their families. Everyone was drinking lemonade and beer, talking about Eisenhower and the new highway plans and who was buying a television set. James was standing by the grill flipping hamburgers, and Mr. Henderson's son, Bobby, who was maybe 7 years old, ran up behind him with a cap gun and fired it 3 times. Pop, pop. It was just a toy, just a child playing cowboys. But James dropped the spatula. He fell to his knees. His hands went over his head and he started screaming. Not words, just sounds, animal sounds. The kind that come from somewhere so deep inside you that they don't have language. Everyone froze. The children stopped playing. The conversations died. Mrs. Henderson grabbed Bobby and pulled him away, and I ran to James, kneeling beside him on the grass, trying to hold him, trying to bring him back. But he didn't see me. His eyes were open, but he was somewhere else. Somewhere I'd never been. Somewhere he'd never let me follow. It took 20 minutes for him to come back. 20 minutes of me holding him while he shook, while our neighbors stood in awkward silence, while our life as normal people crumbled in front of everyone we knew. When he finally stood up, he didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just walked into the house and didn't come out for the rest of the day. Our guests left quietly. No one knew what to say. And I stood in that backyard, surrounded by half-eaten hamburgers and warm lemonade, and I felt something I'd been carrying for 8 years finally break the surface. Shame, deep, bone-crushing shame that my husband was broken and I couldn't fix him. But that was only the beginning. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, let me take you back. Because you need to understand who James was before the war, who we were, and what the war took from both of us. I met James in 1939 at a church social in Cleveland. I was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, working at a department store downtown selling gloves and handbags. James was 20, working at his father's hardware store, with plans to take it over someday. He was tall and gentle, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed to see everything. When he smiled, which was often, his whole face lit up. He loved to laugh. He loved to dance. He loved to talk about the future, about the house we'd build, the children we'd have, the life we'd make together. We got married in April of 1941 at St. Joseph's Cathedral. It was a small wedding, maybe 60 people, and I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit me, with lace sleeves and pearl buttons. James wore a navy suit his father had bought him for the occasion. I remember the weight of his hand in mine when we said our vows, the steadiness of it, the certainty. I remember thinking I was the luckiest woman alive, that I'd found someone good and kind and solid, someone who would be my home. We had 7 months of marriage before Pearl Harbor, 7 months of ordinary happiness. We rented a small apartment above a bakery, and every morning I'd wake up to the smell of fresh bread. James would leave for work at 7 and come home at 6, and we'd eat dinner at our little table by the window, talking about nothing and everything. On Sundays, we'd go to his parents' house for dinner, and his mother would make pot roast and apple pie, and James would sit in his father's chair and read the paper while I helped with the dishes. It was simple. It was good. It was ours, and then everything changed. December 7th, 1941. I was hanging laundry on the line in our building's back alley when Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs came running out, her face pale, her hands shaking. "The radio," she said. "Turn on the radio. The Japanese attacked us. We're going to war." I dropped the clothespins and ran upstairs, and James was already sitting on the couch, listening, his face like stone. I sat beside him and held his hand, and we listened to President Roosevelt's voice crackling through the speaker, declaring war, and I felt James's grip tighten. I knew. Even before he said anything, I knew he was going to enlist. He joined up in January of 1942. The Army took him in February. By March, he was at basic training in Georgia. I wrote him letters every single day. I told him about my job, about the neighbors, about the weather, about the garden I was trying to grow in the tiny plot behind our building. I told him I loved him. I told him to come home safe. I told him I was waiting. His letters back were different. At first, they were long and detailed. He described the training, the other men in his unit, the food, the exhaustion. But as the months went on, the letters got shorter. Less personal. Like he was editing himself, removing anything that might worry me or reveal too much. By the time he shipped out to England in October of 1942, his letters were sometimes just a few sentences. I'm fine, don't worry. I love you. And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. James fought in Europe for 3 years. He was part of the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. He fought through France, through Belgium, through Germany. He was at the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 to 1945. He saw things he would never tell me about. He did things he would never forgive himself for. And somewhere in those years, in the mud and blood and endless noise, the man I married disappeared. He came home in August of 1945. I was standing on the platform at the train station with his parents and my parents and what felt like half of Cleveland. Everyone waving flags and crying and cheering. The soldiers started stepping off the train, and I searched every face, looking for the one I'd memorized. And then I saw him, James, thinner, older, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. He was carrying a duffel bag and walking slowly, like each step hurt. When he saw me, he stopped. Just stopped and stared. And I ran to him, threw my arms around him, buried my face in his neck. But he didn't hold me back, not the way he used to. His arms went around me, yes, but loosely, carefully, like he was afraid of breaking me or afraid I'd break him. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. Everyone told me to be patient, that he needed time, that all the boys were having trouble adjusting, that it was normal. So I was patient. I made his favorite meals. I kept the house quiet. I didn't ask questions. When he woke up screaming in the middle of the night, I held him until the shaking stopped. When he stared at nothing for hours, I sat beside him in silence. When he flinched at sudden noises or couldn't be in crowds or refused to go to church because he couldn't sit in a room full of people, I adapted. I became smaller, quieter, less demanding. I learned to read his moods, to anticipate his needs, to navigate around his pain like it was furniture I couldn't move. Have you ever felt something like this? That constant vigilance? That exhaustion of loving someone who can't love you back the way they used to? We had 3 children. Catherine was born in 1946, Michael in 1948, and Susan in 1951. James loved them, I think, in the way he could love anything after the war. Carefully, from a distance. He worked at the hardware store. He provided for us. He showed up. But there was always a wall between him and the rest of us. Like he was watching our lives through glass, present but not participating. The children learned not to make sudden noises around him. They learned not to ask why Daddy didn't come to their school plays or birthday parties. They learned that Daddy was different, and we didn't talk about why. The incident at the barbecue in 1953 was the first time his trauma had been so visible to people outside our family. After that day, the invitations stopped coming. People were kind but distant. They didn't know what to say. They didn't understand what we now call PTSD, but what then was just considered weakness or cowardice or shell shock that a real man should be able to overcome. James felt the judgment. He withdrew further, and I became the buffer between him and a world that had no patience for broken soldiers. I worked part-time as a seamstress to help with money. I joined the PTA and the church committee. I smiled at neighbors and acted like everything was fine. I became very good at pretending. So good that sometimes I forgot I was pretending. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in a window and wouldn't recognize myself. I'd become this thin, tired woman with permanent worry lines and careful movements, always anticipating the next crisis, always bracing for impact. Stay with me until the end. It's worth it. The years passed. The children grew up. Catherine left for college in 1964. Michael in 1966. Susan in 1969. And then it was just James and me in that house with 40 years of unspoken words hanging between us like smoke. I thought about leaving. I won't pretend I didn't. There were nights when I'd lie awake beside him, listening to him grind his teeth in his sleep, and I'd think about packing a bag and walking out, about starting over somewhere else, about finding out who I'd be if I wasn't constantly managing someone else's trauma. But I never did, not because I was a saint, not because I believed in suffering through marriage no matter what, but because underneath all the damage, underneath all the silence, I still saw glimpses of the man I'd married. And I couldn't abandon him to the hell he was living in, even if he'd never asked me to stay. The change came slowly. In 1982, we were 71 and 69 years old. James had retired. We were living on his pension and Social Security. And one Tuesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen making soup when I heard him crying. Real crying. Deep, wrenching sobs coming from the living room. I put down my spoon and walked in, and he was sitting in his chair, holding an old photograph. It was from our wedding day. The two of us standing on the church steps, young and happy and unmarked by the world. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first time in 37 years he'd apologized for anything related to the war. "I'm so sorry, Dorothy. I wanted to be the man in this picture. I wanted to give you that life. But I couldn't, and I don't know how to tell you what happened to me. I don't have the words." I sat down beside him. I took his hand. And I said something I'd been afraid to say for 4 decades. "Then don't tell me with words. Just let me sit here with you. Just let me be with whoever you are now, instead of pretending you're someone you're not." And he did. He let me in, not all the way. There were still things he couldn't talk about, things he took to his grave. But he let me closer. He started telling me small pieces. About the cold, about the hunger, about watching his friends die. About the German soldier who was maybe 18 years old that James had killed in close combat, whose face he still saw every night when he closed his eyes. About the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't. About the impossibility of explaining war to people who hadn't been there. I listened. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't tell him it was okay or that he should forgive himself. I just listened. And in that listening, something shifted, not healing exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition, a kind of honesty we'd never had before. We had 6 more years together after that conversation. 6 years where we were finally truthful with each other about what the war had cost us, about what our marriage had become, about the children we'd raised in the shadow of trauma, about the life we'd never gotten to live. It wasn't happy, not in any conventional sense, but it was real. And somehow that was more valuable than happiness. James died in 1988 at 77 years old. Heart attack. Quick and painless, the doctors said. At his funeral, our children spoke about him with love and confusion, still trying to understand the father who'd been present but absent, loving but distant. And I stood at his grave and I felt something complicated. Grief, yes, but also relief. Relief that he was finally free from whatever haunted him. Relief that I was finally free from the weight of carrying both of us. Share this with someone who would understand. Someone who's loved someone scarred by war or trauma. Someone who's felt the exhaustion of being the strong one. I'm 93 now. I live in a small apartment near my daughter, Catherine. My children visit often, and they ask me sometimes if I regret staying with James, if I wish I'd left. If I feel like I wasted my life on a marriage that was broken from the start, and I tell them no. Not because it wasn't hard. Not because I wasn't lonely, but because love isn't just the easy parts. It's not just dancing and laughter and Sunday dinners. Sometimes love is standing in the wreckage and choosing to stay. Sometimes love is sitting beside someone who can't speak and saying, "I'm here. I'm still here." Sometimes love is accepting that the person you married exists only in memory and choosing to love the person who replaced him anyway. I don't think James ever fully came back from the war. I don't think he could have. What he saw, what he did, what he survived, it changed him at a level too deep for recovery. But I think in those last 6 years, when we finally stopped pretending, when we finally let truth exist between us, he found a kind of peace. Not happiness, peace. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for after that kind of trauma. The war took millions of lives, but it also took millions of souls. The men who came home but never really returned. And it took the souls of the women who loved them, who spent their lives navigating around wounds they couldn't see, fighting battles they didn't understand, carrying weight no one acknowledged. I learned that you can love someone and also grieve them while they're still alive. That you can hold 2 truths at once, that someone did their best and that their best still broke you. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. That staying doesn't mean you weren't hurt. That loyalty doesn't erase loneliness. Truth does not shout. It simply waits to be heard. I think about the young woman I was standing on that train platform in 1945, waiting for my husband to come home. How naive I was. How I thought love was enough. How I believed that if I was patient enough, gentle enough, strong enough, I could bring him back. And I think about what I'd tell her now. That she can't save him. That she can only walk beside him. That her life will be harder than she can imagine, but that she survive it. That she becomes someone she never expected to be. And that's okay. It has to be okay. Because there's no other choice. The man I loved never came back from the war. But I learned to love the man who did. And maybe that's the most honest version of love there is. Not the fairy tale. Not the romance. But the choice to see someone clearly, with all their damage and all their limitations, and to say, I choose to be here anyway. Not because you deserve it. Not because it's fair. But because this is what we do for people we love. We stay. Even when staying means living with a ghost. Respect does not erase the past. It simply teaches us how to breathe again. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here. And don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.